nature of the a with our expert is because I can only tell you that our school has always on the support
public files on and I think it's insists that there are a number of as system out. It's important, I think, in a context where the society yesterday called the third point than society. It should be imposed by served in practice public bodies anyhow.
An initiative of Islamic terrorism, religious matters.
Because I know the entire of that proposal. As you put, we all the times there is a risk that in many parts of the world it may even to their to in a sense think I strongly even that it preferring
and
what's called in I'm approached by in the sky, so but not in hell neither points. And as the struggle goes, it's important how the law should be understood public. At that time was that I know a lot about that because we managed reason did not tell that. Under the absolute it was a lot, but the time were different. Time
we could
think that media may have files provided they but dangerous idea media of course issues may have been mistaken so if you allow that some years ago language more
certain
thinking about how to behave children. We moved the laws since 50 years ago in Norway. They should have a Pakistan in Oslo, in Norway.
Decision out here.
But in
Коллеги, хочу вам напомнить, что сегодня после этой сессии мы не расходимся и смотрим кино. Все помнят, да? Отлично. Кино... Вот у меня нет анонса, к сожалению, но про волонтеров и про лесные пожары, в общем, да. Если в двух словах. Здесь.
Уважаемые коллеги,
Dear colleagues, I'm trying to check the mic. What channel? Channel 5. Yes, I hope you can hear me, Baroness. Can you hear me? All right, thank you. Okay, 1, 1, 1, 2. Could you help us with the mic, please, and the channel? We are starting. We are just about to start our evening session. Well, I have been able. Thank you for using these. We are starting our evening session. This has been a most interesting day, and it will end on an even more jubilant note because we are starting an exquisite session. I'm one of the happy men who has been honored with listening to Baroness Williams on a number of occasions, and I look forward to this session very much. Lena, who has been who has known Baroness Williams much longer than I do, so it is with pleasure that I give the floor to Lena for introductory remarks. As Andrei does, I think that Shirley's visit to Moscow school is a great event and a manifestation of unwavering support for this school. She is a very busy person, it is true. She's always in a hurry because there are many things on her desk, but the fact that she has found it possible to arrive and make this session. She's made this trip through the tiresome airports and the travel encumbrances. I would like to thank you, Shirley, so much. It is so important that you have enthused us for so many years. It is important that you have always shed your influence on this school, and most importantly, it is her personality. It is her, all of us who have met Baroness Williams here. It's an event for all of us to have enjoyed her friendship and the beauty of our meetings. Her great intelligence and erudition are all expressions of a most unique gift, which she shares with us. Let me say that the school has been honored with having Baroness Shirley Williams as member of our advisory board. Member of the House of Lords, Minister for Education and Science, in the 70s, leader of the Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords, and indeed she is one of the most prominent British politicians. I've even read in an encyclopedia that a mountain has been named after her. I do not know. Maybe I'm mistaken, but that's what I read in an English reference book. Anyway, she's a daughter of very prominent parents, and she has had very prominent husbands. Professor Neustadt, who died in 2003, was here at this school, and he was a great historian and a political analyst. We have been honored to meet him, and there's an urban legend that when President Kennedy was to pronounce the oath, presidential oath, he put his head on a book by Dick Neustadt. He put his head on that book by Dick Neustadt. And the last thing I would like to say is this introduction. Shirley has had a very, an extremely prominent mother, very Britain. A very conspicuous author and she was an author on monumental works on the First World, the Great War. And I have one of her biographies, and in January there'll be a film. And because the Russian cinema may not bring it into Russia soon enough, I shall recommend you to find it online, which is The Testament of Youth. And Andrei will, probably Andrei will help me. She has recommended you to go to the cinema theater. We don't know how will it be called in the Russian box office, but it's The Testament of Youth, which is the original English title. This is a film about love and war. It's a film based on the memoirs of Britain in the period of the Great War, and it's a view of the war by a person with a unique biography, the hopes and dreams of young people on the brink of despair, which cross this line and then come back in a resurrection. In brief, this is a film about the meaning of life in dark times. So and because Lena has allowed me to intervene here, the book that Lena has mentioned is called The Presidential Authority. I translated it into Russian, and our school published it in Russian. And you have a list of all books that this school has published, and every one of you can acquire it. So this is an analysis of how the presidential authority or the presidential power unfolds. So thank you, Shirley. With that such forward, I shall now give the floor to Baroness Williams. Thank you.
Andrei, thank you very much also to Irena and also to Yuri. I want to begin by saying, forget about being called Lady Anything. I don't use the title, I don't believe in titles, and I hope you'll just call me Mrs. Williams. Number two, I want to reflect to the humble beginnings of the Moscow School. When I first met Yena, it was on the steps of Strasbourg Cathedral. She was wearing travel-stained clothes. She had been traveling for 2.5 days by bus from Russia to Strasbourg with nothing much to eat except the odd stale sandwich. And I met her there because I was in a rather grand position as a visiting minister for the United Kingdom. And Yelena was in the position of a sort of beggar, trying to see if she could raise money from somewhere in order to start her ideal vision of the Moscow School. She had nothing except the clothes she was wearing, not much more than that, her own reputation, her extraordinary character and courage. And there she was in France, a country she had not visited before, but she knew because her knowledge of art has been always very great and considerable, with an utter determination that the new Russia, born out of the Second World War, would become a democratic Russia with a commitment to liberty and freedom, but also to the great traditions of Russia, its courage, its endurance, its vision, its literature, its music, its ballet, the huge contribution that Russia could make to the world, and many of us still hope and believe it will make to the world. She then, on the basis of that, sat on the steps of the cathedral for 2 or 3 days until finally the then Secretary of the Council of Europe, a wonderful French woman called Catherine de la Lumière, stopped and said to her staff, "Who is this Russian woman sitting on the bottom of these stairs? Is she waiting for something to eat, some beggar's donation?" And the staff all said what staff always do say, right up to now. They said, "Oh, don't bother, it's just a poor woman, you don't want to be bothered with her." Catherine La Lumière was a true leader. Instead of walking by, as most leaders do, she stopped and said, "No, she's an amazing looking woman, I want to meet her." And she made her staff bring our dear friend Yelena to her office, and within half an hour Yelena had persuaded Catherine de la Lumière, Secretary General of the Council of Europe, that she had something unique to offer. So I won't accept any compliments from Yelena. She has shown a courage, a determination, a perseverance that I'm not sure I would ever be capable of. The second thing I want to say, because it will, I hope, amuse you a little, is that I listened with great interest and very considerable respect to the lecture you heard about corruption in Russia. And I want to say just 3 quick things about it. The first is that all of us have encountered corruption. When I was first a young minister in my 20s, I remember meeting a gentleman, I think nowadays we would call him an oligarch, from Sri Lanka, Ceylon, a very wealthy man and powerful man indeed. And he was rather annoyed that he had been given only a junior minister, a very young junior minister, to meet by the UK government. And he made it plain that he thought he should meet at least a cabinet minister. But he put up with me, and at the end of our brief meeting, he shook my hand. And when I opened my hand, I found in it a £5 note. That's roughly a bit more than 30 rubles. I looked at the note, which was crumpled in my hand, which he'd put in his hand and passed to me. And I said to him, "I don't come that cheap, Mr. Savundra." Now, I mention that to you because the first step with being corrupted is to see it as essentially a diminution of yourself, a belief that you are buyable, that you can be bought and sold like any other object. And you have to stop corruption very early on by making it quite plain that you no longer respect the human being who is capable of either offering it or accepting it. Let me move on. I'm going to talk, I hope not for too long, about 3 things. The first of those is a little bit about history, because the sharp distinctions, sometimes the failure to understand, between Europe and Russia depends quite a lot on history. And I'm going to say just a little bit about that history, not for long, but maybe 10 minutes. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the attempt to build a new Europe after the Second World War. It failed after the First World War, but after the Second World War there was a real attempt to try to build such a Europe. And one of the things that you may not know or realize is that during that time there was also a really substantial effort to try to bring Russia into the structures of building that new Europe, which would have included, not directly, but indirectly, Russia. It was rejected at the time because Russia didn't want that kind of association with Europe. I then want to say a little bit about the European Union, which began by being one of the, I think, finest political expressions of an attempt to build a world of understanding and peace. And then it got into more and more difficulties, and I will say a little bit about what it's achieved, a little bit about what it's failed to achieve, and end up by talking a bit about the crisis it faces. Not a crisis as existential as yours, but nevertheless quite a serious crisis about whether the European Union can survive as what was originally intended to be a political structure, not just an economic market structure. I will begin. You have to go back a very long way in Europe to the origins of the concept, if not of democracy, at least of the concept of, in the simplest way, human rights. Next year, in Britain, we will celebrate the 800th anniversary of something called Magna Carta, which is Latin for the Great Charter, and which laid down a very simple principle. That principle was that the decision before a court about a man's guilt or innocence was not to be taken by the president or even by some senior judge, but by a jury of his or her own fellow citizens. If you were an aristocrat, it was a jury of aristocrats. If you were an ordinary citizen, it was a jury of ordinary citizens. It was the very first step towards the concept of citizens' right to be involved in making judgments about their fellow citizens. Along with it went a number of other things about property, about ownership and so forth, I don't need to bother you with. But the beginning of it all is quite well worth remembering, and it was something that deeply affected, in particular, the Anglo-Saxons. You can wheel on very fast, because this is going to be a very fast lesson in history. The next lesson I want to mention was in 1688, the same century as the English Civil War, a war between parliamentarians and the king's supporters, which laid down for the first time, and this is important for Russia as well, the concept of a constitutional monarchy. In other words, what the king or queen could or could not do depended upon whether they lived within the rules of a constitutional pattern in which, in order to have the right to tax the people for any kind of tax, including military tax, civil tax, and so forth, the king or queen had to carry the support of Parliament. Not a democratic parliament, a parliament drawn by 2 or 3 people from each region of the country, but it did end the idea of a monarch with no limitations. That concept continued in France, in Germany, in Spain, and in Russia with the Tsardom. So this was a breakthrough into the modern world, that you could not have a king or queen with divine power and with absolute power. Always it had to respond to what was said by Parliament. And that was essentially the birth of the idea of parliamentary sovereignty, which, to put it simply, means that the last word rests with Parliament and not with the king, not with the president, not even, for that matter, with the judges, but with Parliament. It's still a very powerful force in Britain today. Fast forward to 2 other revolutions, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. The French Revolution, well, strictly speaking, the American Revolution comes first, of 1776, which laid down a detailed constitution which included the rights of citizens in great detail, the election of judges, and a number of other concepts of that kind. Sorry, are you troubled? No. Then we move on to the French Revolution. 2 things to say about that. First, it was an extremely bloody revolution, but it culminated in something called, which you probably have heard of, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It laid down what were the fundamental rights of its citizens, les citoyens. It said what those rights were, which included the right to life, the right to a fair trial, the right to have a voice heard, and many other things. It had one huge fault in it, which tells you a great deal about the way the world has moved. When the revolutionaries, who were women, came to the first meeting of the Congress of Deputies in Paris after the war had been successfully won by the rebels against King Louis and an absolute monarchy, the women revolutionaries came with a plea for a declaration pour les droits des femmes, a declaration for the rights of women. The deputies, all of them rebels, laughed their heads off and told the women to go away. In other words, there was still no rights for women, only rights for men. And that was the limitation of that revolution. We're fast forward now for the last bit, the aftermath of the First World War. One of the things it's crucial to remember, in Russia one always remembers, of course, the revolution, the overthrow of the Tsar, the fight that went on, particularly in places like what was then Ukraine as part of Russia, between the white armies and the red armies, and the philosophy and aims and talent of targets of the Russian Revolution, remarkable revolution by any standards, one that overthrew the whole hierarchy of the past. But it's also important to say that tragically, the aftermath of the First World War was one of almost unbroken despair and misery. In Russia, many people lost their lives, and of course, many of those who lost their lives were small farmers. Small farmers tend to be the basis of a democracy, and the overthrow of small farmers in Russia was extremely serious for Russia's future. But perhaps more importantly, what people don't remember is the extent to which we live even today, with the aftermath of the First World War. The First World War was not a war mainly between nations, it was a war mainly between empires. Look at your map and think for a moment. You had the Russian Empire, which covered the whole area that later became the Soviet Union and a bit more. You had the Ottoman Empire. We are looking right now in Syria, in Palestine, in Israel, and many other parts of the Middle East, including at the rise of things like the ISIS extreme movement of Muslim fundamentalists, at the wreck of the Ottoman Empire, an empire that was headed by the Turkish Sultan, which was a reasonably peaceful empire, which included all those countries I mentioned, which have now become part of a fragmented chaos of the end of the Ottoman Empire. The third empire was the Habsburg Empire, which actually indeed controlled most of the Balkans, not only Austria and Hungary, but many of the countries round about it. You had finally the only two empires that survived more or less in one piece out of those five empires, and that were the empires of Britain and France. What was significant about the empires of Britain and France, compared to those of Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and the Habsburg Empire, was that they were essentially maritime empires. They were empires made by navies and not by armies. The Russian Empire was based upon a very powerful military, not very well trained, but strong and large. The Austro-Habsburg Empire, the same thing. But Britain and France had established their empires not in Europe, but miles away in Asia and Africa. And those empires lasted in more or less one piece, all the way up to the Second World War, and in some cases beyond it. It's very funny, I think, you may notice that even when you look at something like the Ebola crisis, you find France putting in doctors and nurses in Mali and in other parts of the old French Empire. Britain put hers into Sierra Leone and parts of the old British Empire. These forces are still terribly strong. So much for that. I just want to make the point that the period of the end of the First World War was the one which brought to an end the age of imperialism, and it was then succeeded by the age of ideology and to some extent the age of nationality. End of that first part of history. But don't forget from that history two things which are going to go on to my second part, and those are, number one, the background of all these European countries of a great past, of great power, of great influence, and secondly, the long, long ancient tradition what one might call individual rights. And I've talked about that in relation particularly to Europe. It's not true as you get beyond even France that you have that tradition in quite the same way. Let's leap to the end of the Second World War. And this is the point where Russia, the Soviet Union, of course, at that time, turns her back on the idea of relating very closely to Western Europe. A destroyed Western Europe, not including the United Kingdom, which survived, but the rest of Western Europe, essentially was economically flat, dead, nearly dead, at the end of the Second World War, occupied, blitzed, bombed, huge numbers of casualties. And one of the outcomes of that was a real fear in the United States in particular, but also the United Kingdom, that Western Europe would be swept by communism. Communism in Russia was very strong. It had clearly made great changes. It had brought in certain major reforms in education, in health, in transport, and other things of that kind. The price of it, the huge losses under Stalin of civilian life, were not well known in the West at all. In my own country, Stalin was always known as Uncle Joe, and he was regarded as a very helpful and important figure. There was very little knowledge of the genocides that had happened under his rule in the 30s, except a little bit, and mostly the left wing didn't want to talk about it. So what happened was that the Americans decided to introduce a hugely generous economic plan, which would actually be applied to Western Europe and will tend to save it from being swept by communist ideology, which the United States had never cared for, and it hadn't changed. But the Marshall Plan was an amazing plan. Not only did it have millions and millions of dollars in it, but it was actually run largely in each country by the Europeans from that country in partnership with America. It wasn't a dictatorship. It wasn't an attempt to push them around. France ran the Marshall Plan along with America. Even Germany ran the Marshall Plan along with America, but was not bossed or told what to do. It was not imperial in that sense. It was a genuine partnership. Russia, in 1946, was invited to join the Marshall Plan if she wanted to do so. She decided she would not do so, and therefore went on being a much slower economic recovery than would have happened if that partnership had been possible. But understandably, given America's long ideology of anti-communism and fear of communism, one could see why Russia was very reluctant to enter into that agreement. But it's worth putting on the table that that offer was made. The next offer that was made to Russia, again rather surprisingly, was when the very first meeting began of the European Union. At that time it was the European Community. And the first meeting, the first brick, if you like, laid down in that structure was the so-called European Coal and Steel Community of 1951. What did it mean? It meant something very radical, that all production of coal and steel, which in 1951 were the major forms of armament, the major sources of arms, were to be put under the control not of individual nations, but of the European Commission itself. In other words, there would be a grouping of countries, at this time there were 6 of them, that would make sure that no coal and no steel was produced in any of the countries that would lead to building up military power. And those countries included, of course, not only France, but crucially Germany. 6 years after the end of the Second World War, Germany and France entered into a partnership which included the resources for military power. Crucial if you were trying to build trust. In 1955, that leapt forward into a new system. The European Community was developed, and we should make no pretense about it, and because of time I must hurry up, we must make no pretense about it. It was intended always, from the very beginning, when it was largely built by the foreign secretaries of Belgium, France, Germany, and for that matter, Italy. The point about it was to make sure there would never be another war in Europe. Now, at that time, Europe was not spread to include the Soviet Union, the line was drawn, of course, along the line between East Germany and West Germany, the other countries of the Soviet Union, under Soviet Union control, like Czechia, Hungary, Poland, and so forth. So when we talked about there will never be another war in Europe, what we were talking about was there'll never be another war in what would be properly called, I think, Western and Central Europe. But the European community in those early stages was fundamentally a political concept, and the idea was that you would start by making war impossible, you would control the means of war, and you would then move on to gradually the development of a political community which, among other things, would share most of the decisions that were made about strategic considerations. There was, at the time of the establishment of the coal and steel community, a long discussion about whether Russia should be invited to join, which finally concluded in the probability that she would not wish to do so. I believe that she was tentatively sound out at the time, but by that time already relations were sufficiently poor so that Russia decided not to enter. It would have meant Russian military, of course, coming under international control, and it's understandable that Russia, as the second greatest military power in the world, well, even perhaps the first alongside the United States, would not have wished to become dependent in military terms in that way it's suggested. Let's now leap very fast, because what then happened, this was the high tide, if you like, of European idealism. And it was very marked idealism. It was idealism that spread to all kinds of things, to the exchange of students, to universities being shared by what later became known as the Erasmus program. It included basic social rights for members of the European community. It included common pensions. It included the right to share those advantages. It included pressure to include foreign languages in education and so forth. It then moves downhill rather fast, and let me say one of the main causes of that was, curiously enough, the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom had been a leading engine in the creation not so much of the European community as of the creation of a democratic Europe. We were the authors, in effect, of the so-called European Convention of Human Rights, which listed a very large number of human rights for every citizen, establishing to things like the right to have a private life, the right to the family, the right to vote, the right to be heard, and culminating in a court that doesn't exist in any other continent in the world and still exists to this day. The European Court of Human Rights is the only court in the world which enables an individual to bring a case against a state, and which then requires the state, if it is found to be breaching the individual rights of that person, to have to make sustenance to return to that individual. There's nowhere else, not even the American Court of Human Rights, which has that same power, and it is a unique power because it puts the individual ahead of the state, and that's almost the only case in the world one can think of where that's true. But the United Kingdom, having been the major author of the European Court of Human Rights, is today one of its major critics, because it turns out, back to parliamentary sovereignty, that some of our parties, in particular our Conservative Party, is very reluctant to see anything superseded parliamentary sovereignty, which is a specifically British parliamentary sovereignty, and therefore there is now a substantial attack against the idea of the European Convention and the European Court of Human Rights. That comes, incidentally, from a country which has been very lucky in having virtually none of its rights challenged, let alone overthrown, and therefore doesn't fully realise how cruel the world can be. Let me jump finally to what has now happened to the European community. Margaret Thatcher, greatly admired in Russia, was, as you know, the great champion of the market. She favoured the European community for one reason really only, and that was not its political aspects, which she didn't like. She was a complete supporter of parliamentary British sovereignty, but because she thought it was the high road to a single huge market, which would then enable Europe to be an extremely powerful bargaining factor in treaties, in decisions about safety of products, quality of products, and all the rest of it. When Jacques Delors, probably the finest of all the presidents of the Commission, a civil service job, went to Mrs. Thatcher, who was elected for the first time in 1979, in order to discuss with her the next step in the union of the European community, the moving on to a higher level of integration. He discovered that there's only one thing she was willing to do. She was unwilling to talk about a stronger European Parliament. She was unwilling to talk about, for example, writing into human rights, additional rights to cover things like the computer revolution. What she wanted and what she was strongly in favour of was what was called a single market, which meant you remove all the obstacles to trade, all of them, within the area of that market, and that market was the whole of Europe. This was before the enlargement, before the change in the Soviet Union, so we're really again only talking about Western and Central Europe. But she supported the idea of the single market with all her strength, and that then became the one way forward that Jacques Delors could see for the European community. The single market was therefore established in the 1970s. It was steadily built up, and it's existed from that day to this, and it has turned the European Union into the biggest trading area in the world and the strongest bargaining fighter in all the world's international treaties, extending now to Asia, United States, Australia, and so forth, the whole lot. But it is very strictly a commercial concept, not a political concept. It is a market concept, and it underpins, therefore, many of the things that the European community, or the European Union as it now is, does. What was left was the political vision, what was called an ever closer union, bringing politics, parliamentary laws, all these things into the Union's scope. That has been horrifying to the United Kingdom. It doesn't want to move in that direction. It may well decide in the next year or two that it wants to get out. There will be a considerable conflict between the commercial and trade interests who desperately want to stay in, including most of our industry, and on the other side, the pressure against it of people who feel they have now created a party called UKIP, which main purpose is to fight against membership of the European community, European Union, and there will be a referendum in 3 years' time. But more importantly, there will be a new election next year in the spring, in May, and the formation of the government after that will turn to a very great extent on whether or not the country, the British public, want to remain within the European Union. Let me make a final point. I said that there was a crisis facing the European Union, although it looks, I know, strong, and indeed, in political terms, it's fairly calm at the moment. That crisis is not just the United Kingdom with its population deeply divided. That crisis is around the nature of the Eurozone. You're having trouble in Russia, God knows, with your economy, with the fall in the price of oil and so forth, and not least with the sanctions that have gone along with the arguments about the taking over of Crimea, and now the arguments about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine and the European Union. But the important thing to say is that there's an even bigger crisis, and that is the Eurozone. The Eurozone has grown hardly at all, less than Russia, in the next few years. The result of that, or the outcome of that, has been partly because the Eurozone was always a very, very difficult invention. And I'll say why. It was a difficult invention because it tried to bring together extraordinarily powerful and basically rule of law countries like Germany, like not Britain because she didn't join, but Germany, to the Scandinavian world, Holland. When I say rule of law, I mean countries where, put it bluntly, getting your taxes paid is not a problem. Where, to put it bluntly, people conduct their commercial and economic business in a reasonably open and transparent way. That tradition has never extended to Southern Europe, to Spain, Greece, Italy, where, for example, cheating on paying taxes is a way of life. You're a fool if you pay your full taxes. The only people that do that are employed members of the manufacturing class. So what you've got is this bringing together culturally of a group of freewheeling countries which have enjoyed a great deal of individual freedom, but also very little civic sense of as it were, having to behave well together. And other countries, not least Holland, Germany, Sweden, with a very strong sense of civic probity, of proper behaviour, and the one lot are furious with the other. Because, of course, what's happened in the end is that the good guys are being asked to continually bail out the naughty ones, and the strain on Europe is very considerable for that reason. I'll end by saying this. I'm sorry I've gone on a bit long. I deeply believe that, as I said at the beginning, that Russia has a huge amount to contribute. It's a remarkable country. One of the things that the school did for me was to take me to regions I'd never been to places like Siberia, Perm, and many other parts of Russia. And one cannot but be amazed, almost astonished, by the variety, the extraordinary grouping of cultures and languages and all the rest of it in Russia. It is a wonderful country, but I think somehow it has to find its way towards a governing system that works. And in the modern age, with all that we have, not only internet but all the rest of it, we cannot continue to exclude the individual from a major part in the running of his own country.
Colleagues, you have been here. Let us take our time for as short time as we have for a short discussion, and I think that Mrs. Williams' statements have been very succinct and comprehensive. Please introduce yourselves and make sure to speak at a moderate pace. Gapur Gaisulay from the Chechen Republic. Mrs. Williams, there's a saying which may sound somewhat harsh, but it may be a myth from the adepts or the supporters of the liberal idea. However, the saying is that when somebody has nothing to be proud of, he or she starts to be proud of his nationality. In your view, do you believe that the feeling or the sense of pride is a part of the system of values, and what is it that you are as a person proud of?
Yelena mentioned that my mother was a well-known writer about the First World War, and what actually infused her philosophy of life was the fact that she had been a military nurse of soldiers being wounded and killed in the First World War. And in 1917, she was ordered by her senior commanding nurse to nurse German prisoners. What she came to feel after nursing German prisoners for months on end, at a time when her brother had been killed and her fiancé had been killed and her two closest brothers and friends had been killed, was that German soldiers dying called for their mothers just like British soldiers dying. And so she came to the conclusion that she eventually became a pacifist. But she came to the conclusion that the differences between nations was very much less than the difference between human beings as individuals. Those who understood mercy and courage, and those who refused to understand it because they were locked into their own national attitudes. I think one of the things we're slowly learning is a phrase she often used, which was, above all nations is humanity. It's a Greek phrase, it's an old phrase. But she felt very strongly that we had as human beings to realize that this was the key fact. Now let me bring it up to the present time in answering your question, because I'm not myself a proud nationalist. Some things my country have done shame me. Some things they've done I'm very proud of. That must also be true for a Russian, must be also true for a German. I think what I came to think, and still do believe as a politician, which is what I am, is that there, with luck, the huge challenges that are facing the world as a whole, particularly things like the running out of resources, climate change, the issues of, for example, floods, all the rest of it, and on the other hand, the issues of, for example, such things as drought and parchment, is going to force the human race, if it is to survive, and I don't give us long, I think we've got about 50 years, to confront these challenges itself together. And the space things are only part of the fun of this. There's also a hugely serious challenge. And you can see that in Russia, for example, because your forests are one of the very small number of things that are actually reducing the danger of climate change. So quite simply, I think we're facing such huge challenges which are international, that unless we learn to behave internationally, we're going to die, quite simply.
Идем дальше. Прошу, сударыня, называйте себя, пожалуйста.
Ekaterina Lushnikova from Vyatka. We have listened to Alexei Bukalov, a Russian journalist, who recounted Pope Francis, who said that the Third World War may have already started. How would you comment on this line?
I don't think it has already started. I think what's certainly true is that we're very much on the edge of going back into the Cold War. But I don't believe that President Putin would like to see another world war, nor do I believe any of the current leaders are mad enough to want another world war. If the Pope meant by that we're entering a third world war in the sense I was just talking about, that's obviously true, a world war for saving the world. If he meant that in the narrow political sense that we're heading for a third world war, it's one possibility, I think only one possibility, and that is that the risks that both sides are taking at the present time, for example, flying unexpected flights, insisting on air borders being crossed and so forth, yes, there's a danger. And I've lived long enough to have seen in the Second Cold War, the one that began in 1948 actually, and then went on all the way up to, it ended with Gorbachev, and now it may be starting again. But on two occasions, I've done a lot of work on nuclear weapons internationally. And on two occasions, I actually sat and waited for the world to come to an end. One was the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was when, you may remember, Khrushchev sent nuclear-tipped missiles to Cuba. But in all fairness, the United States had said it was going to send nuclear-tipped missiles to Turkey. And that war eventually was brought to an end. It never went over the line. They were very close. And there were 2 days when it really turned on seconds. And what many people don't know, but I do know, is that through my husband, is that President Kennedy wrote a letter to the Secretary of the United Nations at that time. A letter was written by him to the Secretary of the United Nations, U Thant, in which he said, if you send this letter back to me, the letter I wrote to you, I will say yes. And what the letter said to Khrushchev was, if we agree to withdraw our missiles from Turkey, will you agree to withdraw your missiles from Cuba? And the answer was yes. And that saved the world from going to war. Much more recently than that, I think the other really serious threat of nuclear war is still with us, because the one country in the world I think is almost paranoid is North Korea. But it's like dealing with somebody who's mentally seriously ill in your own household. Fortunately, his country is weak. he himself is not very well, but it's the one country that I know of where I think they would be capable of dropping a nuclear bomb as a way of stopping anybody attacking them in any way at all. So I've seen those crises, I've been present at one of them, and I think that isn't likely to be repeated, nor do I think your president would be likely to repeat it. Nor do I think, least of all, the US president would be likely to repeat it, because he's already, incidentally, since many of you are probably quite cynical, it is important to recognise that the CIA report, which come out under the Senate, is a report that he welcomed and did nothing to try to stop. It's important to say that, because he's a man who certainly would not wish in any way to be part of either a war or an acceptance of torture by a whole range of countries. I don't think so.
Коллега, вам слово, прошу. Да.
Alex Klischko from Poltava in the Ukraine. Mrs. Williams, it is quite often when common folk say that the son of a colonel will not become a general because the general has his own son. In the Ukraine, it is quite common when high-ranking officials lobby the interests of their children for them to be promoted to high offices. Commenting on such situations, I often quote the example of Britain, where there is a long-standing tradition of dynasties and the family traditions, including the family traditions of taking up the high offices. Are there cases in Britain when children who are not worthy of their parents? And what should countries do to combat this nepotism?
I think in the last century, I would say there were many examples. It's also true, you might be amused to hear, that the British public schools, that's to say private fee-paying schools of great quality, are nowadays stuffed to about a third of their capacity with the sons, mostly the sons, of Chinese leaders and of Russian oligarchs. So they're becoming international in a rather peculiar way. Let me, however, also say that I think your attitude is a little bit out of date. I'll give you only the cases of the last 6 Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom. Our present Prime Minister bears out your argument. He went to Eton, and then he went to a great university. But his immediate predecessor was somebody who actually left school at the age of 16, whose father was unemployed. His predecessor, I should say, as a conservative leader. His father was unemployed most of his life. He left school at the age of 16. It wasn't even a selective school, it was an ordinary state school. He then became a trainee in a bank and eventually joined the Conservative Party, and by way of working hard, ended up as Prime Minister. He was called John Major. Before him, Mrs. Thatcher went to a state school, not a private school, and although she's undoubtedly a very clever woman, she could not possibly be described as the child of a dynasty, since her father was a grocer, a man running a shop in a small town with no particular power at all. He was a conservative, hard-working conservative, local man, but he had no money, no rich money, no great friends, no associations with wealthy businessmen, and he sent his daughter to a state school. If I go back from him, the last Labour Prime Minister before Tony Blair was Jim Callaghan. I worked for him, he was my Prime Minister. He went to his wife, his mother was a widow of a small, low-level naval officer. He went to a state school. He left school at the age of 16 to work for the post office, an ordinary postman, and he was never, ever associated with great wealth, great fortune, great anything. So I can say, and I can say it in all honesty, but I knew these men and women, that in the case of 5 out of 7, they came from a background which had no influence, no money, no wealth, no influence at all. So while I would agree with you, I think probably what you're saying would still be true, I wish I could say it was otherwise, but it's not, of the City of London, of the financial sector. You'd be right. But in the political world, you're not right. It's very straightforward to get much higher up, even to the level of Prime Minister, without any background of wealth or support at all.
Так. Коллега, у которого друг, пожалуйста.
Thank you. Denis Petrenko, Bryansk. Our country now, so the situation with Ukraine is not very good between Russia and Ukraine. So Crimea is another bad story, doesn't smell well. And if we go back in history, so you had Falkland Islands, so Argentina issue, same thing actually some time ago. How does your country find a way out of similar situations?
The right example, thank you for your question, the right example is not the Falklands. I mean, whether you like it or not, legally, the Falklands were part of Britain. They were part of sovereign Britain and they had their own parliament and so forth. So they were within the rule of law. Where you can certainly draw a parallel, and I would agree with you, is the parallel with Northern Ireland. Our relationship to Northern Ireland, which grew out of a part of the United Kingdom which was deeply split on religious grounds between Protestant and Roman Catholic, which is still quite bitterly divided, although there's huge attempts to try to bring it together, is much closer to what you're saying about Ukraine and Russia. Northern Ireland was always part of the United Kingdom, but it was a rather separate part. Ukraine was for many years part of Russia, but it was a slightly separate part, a different language, in our case a different religion. So I will draw my analogy from Northern Ireland. What's happened there, and it's taken years and years, has been the gradual building up of a relationship, of peaceful relationship between Catholic and Protestant, which was preceded, as you probably know, by years of violence, terrorist actions, blowing up youngsters, children, on both sides, both Catholic and Protestant, bitter conflicts. No agreement to send kids to the same school. They all went to different schools, Catholic schools, Protestant schools, and so forth. And for a long time, and this is a significant role of Russia, the Republic of Ireland supported, in military and other ways, the Catholic terrorists in Northern Ireland. There was never a war between Britain and the Republic of Ireland, the part that became independent years ago, but there were always very strained relations. Finally, and I pray that this might happen between Ukraine and Russia, the two prime ministers got together. They set up between them a joint committee which discussed points of conflict like housing, jobs, and so forth. And eventually they signed something which we call the Good Friday Agreement, because it was signed on Good Friday, nearly 10 years ago now, which laid down that the Irish government and the British government would work together in trying to resolve the terrorism and the violence in Northern Ireland. And that has begun to happen. We are now very close to the Republic of Ireland. I suggest that's the way that Russia and Ukraine may eventually be able to talk to one another, because they share a common culture, they share at least two different languages which are very close to one another, and they have a common sovereignty. So the parallel is almost exact. And I think, therefore, that there's a real hope that you'll get out of this with Russia being, certainly including Crimea, but also having a relationship with Ukraine. And I hope that happens, that like we've done in Northern Ireland, the understanding would be that Ukraine would not join, in the short run anyway, any military alliance that would be thought to be in any sense a threat to Russia, and vice versa.
Так, канал «Дождь», пожалуйста, сударыня.
Ksenia Batana from Moscow, Dost TV channel. My question has to do Yanukovych Maidan started. Yanukovych did not sign the Euro integration agreement. That's why Maidan started. And so now that's Ukraine, a completely different country. And in Europe, they are discussing seriously that Ukraine might become a part of the European Union, but Ukraine is part of the post-Soviet space. What do you think? So, do you think that Ukraine is a Russian problem, or European Union problem, or the United States Union? Who will be finally responsible for this huge country, which is located in the Central Europe, is 50 million people? Who will hold the final responsibility for this country?
Responsibility has to be Ukraine itself, no one else. But I think I'm right in saying, but I'd be delighted if any of my colleagues would like to add their voices to this. I think the European Union is very conscious that it would be inappropriate for the Ukraine to join the European Union now. It doesn't mean that there won't be trade relationships, there probably will be. It doesn't mean there won't be visits and meetings and so forth, but I don't think really that's at all likely that the European Union, given its present problems already, will want to see Ukraine as a member. What it might do, and it's done, if I can draw you another example, which you may not like, but it's true. The other country that played for some time with the idea of joining the European Union was Turkey. Now, Turkey was a different set of problems because Turkey is culturally obviously different, religiously different and so on. But Turkey was very keen to join 10 years ago. The endless process of very long negotiations going on and on continue to this day. Turkey is probably no nearer joining the European Union than she was 10 years ago. The European Union is very good at having endless negotiations. It was Winston Churchill who once said, jaw is better than war. And I think that's the attitude that will be held by a lot of the European Union countries. In particular, countries like Sweden or Holland would not want to see the Ukraine, still not really a stable democracy, join the European Union now. So my guess will be that there will be a sort of trade association within sometime in the next 10 years, which after we already extend to countries throughout the world. And I don't myself think that there's any likelihood that the Ukraine will become a member of the European Union in the near future. But I do invite any of my colleagues who don't agree. I'm looking at them all. Some are already fair enough asleep.
Shall I say one?
Yes, please.
I think a very important reason why Ukraine won't be in the European Union anytime soon, is that the European Union allows free movement of labour, and no one in Central or Western Europe likes the thought of millions of Ukrainians coming to Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and so on. I mean, whereas in Russia, of course, Russia accepts Ukrainian immigration.
Um, 10 years ago, sitting up here, I was sitting here with Roderick Braithwaite, who was then chairman of the Moscow School, and we were debating very much the same sort of issues. And at the end of our discussion, Roderick and I said to the entire table like this, who do you think might join the European Union first? Turkey or Russia? And every single hand round the table went up for Turkey, and Roderick and I both voted for Russia, and we were all wrong.
Коллеги, я должен сказать о том, что
I need to say at this point that so those were the words of our experts, and I'd like to introduce Professor Skidelsky. So he made his first comment first, and then Quentin Peel, our friend, he was the second to make his comment. And so all our experts, these two experts, will speak at length tomorrow. Two questions, and then we'll wrap up. Two more questions. Sveta Shmilova, please. Sveta, our graduate, Svetlana. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Williams, for the wonderful, spirited presentation of European institutions. And I wanted to ask you about European institutions. It looks like there are many new challenges, modern challenges, and not always these institutions can welcome these challenges. That's why they need to be modernized as well, probably. Otherwise, they can't meet the challenge, welcome the challenge. So, what do you think these changes in the Western institutions should be? What should they look like? What kind of changes were needed? Because there is a lot of red tape, there is a lot of bureaucracy. Some institutions are formal, and they're superfluous. So, for example, they talk about the human rights declaration of human rights, etc. And so they used to talk about the right to live, and now they're talking about the right to death, like euthanasia, for example. So and then we talk about the rights to have a house, and now there are so many migrants that probably there should be right not to be a resident of certain states, or not to be impinged in certain rights and possibilities if it goes to another country. So because everything changes, because if there is a right to look west or to look east, and the certain is if it's a gate for the Western civilization thoughts and ideas. What about self-determination? Where should we look? To east, to west? So what are the processes in Catalonia, in Scotland? So the whole world is burning, is brewing. And so what's happening? What are the changes in the institutions?
I have to say that I would keep you all here till dawn if I tried to answer that question. So I'll just touch upon a couple of things, if I may. One of them, which I think is crucial, is that there must be some institutional redress for the individual against the state. That means you have to have totally independent courts. It means, secondly, that the right of people to present their case must not be blockaded in any way. It means that you would, and don't forget the first one, it means that even the president must be able to be challenged by an individual. Was full, as you rightly imply, of constitutional rights to things like housing, jobs, and all the rest of it. States can't deliver that. They may mean to, they may have a good intention, but in the end, in a globalized economic world, they are not the authors entirely of their own ability to meet those needs. For example, take Russia. A large part of your gross domestic product is oil. You have no power to determine the oil price. It is largely determined by Saudi Arabia and one or two other countries a very long way away. So if a state like Russia was genuinely to make a promise, based upon their proposals for oil revenue would be 5 years down the road, they could make a terrible mistake. And people would condemn them, but they wouldn't have actually had the ability to deliver the promise that they might even genuinely have tried to make. So you have to be very careful about rights. Legal rights, yes, you can usually deliver on. Economic rights, you can aim towards, but you can't necessarily deliver on them. The other thing I think is that the permeation of your institutions with the concept of civic duties and civic responsibilities along with civic rights is crucial. I don't boast about it. We haven't been very good at it in Britain. We have civic rights, but we haven't got a strong sense of civic responsibility. It takes a slow, long development. But organisations like this school have been part of the development of that civic responsibility and civic duty, and I would say that there's nothing more important to do than that. Finally, I think that Russia has some huge advantages, which it may not see at the moment, and one is obviously resources. Another is the fact that you are not overwhelmed with huge population surges like China or like India. You've got a fairly low population in a very large country, and that means that it should be possible for Russia to develop in ways that aren't open to countries which are desperate for resources, crowded out, and so forth. All of which leads me to think that what you need more than anything else in the world is a fairly long period of peace, because you have lost millions in wars, more than proportionately almost anywhere else. In my country, we recognise that because we've been commemorating the First World War. And Russia, both in the First and Second World War, lost hands over fist young men and young women. So I think given a period of peace and the gradual emergence of the rule of law, which means, of course, confronting corruption, as that brilliant young lady said earlier today, that Russia should have a good future. But at the moment, you're going through a very rough time, and that's not unique to other countries. Other countries do too.
И последний вопрос, коллега.
And the last question, Ingushetia. Thank you very much. Mrs. Williams, so I've been here, I've identified Ahmed Bargat, Ingushetia. I've been here for 3 days already. On these 3 days, I'm learning more and more process and Magna Carta, which is 800 years, and that was a pivotal, essential part is human being. And nevertheless, why in Europe so fascism appeared? This is amazing. Why there was slavery in Europe? And so this is a very naive question. But I want just to get your thinking. So how these two things can be juxtaposed, and then sexual degradation, and why is it happening, taking place there? Sexual degradation is a new term. This is very interesting terminology that's just been coined new. So that's the way he is learning what real liberalism is, okay? Mm-hmm.
You have to look for Ingushetia, such brilliant use of language. Look, liberals are like almost everything else you can look at. They're often hypocrites. They aim high and they fail to reach that point. Let's take the example of the United States, which I think generally is a country which is democratic, but which is also capable of having the CIA do things which it will deny doing because it's so contrary to liberal principle. I can talk about my own country. When it brought in the European Court of Human Rights and the European Declaration of Human Rights, it made it clear at the very beginning that this was not to apply to the colonies. The colonies, of which there were many, could not bring a case in a British court for example, rectifying a failure to recognise their human rights. Slavery, almost the whole of the world was involved in slavery, and that really only ended in it didn't even end, it's still there, but we mostly abolished it in the British Empire in 1803 by stopping people carrying slaves to and fro anymore. But before that, there had been a century where slaves had been taken from Africa to America, and they grew cotton and planted it and were slaves in the south of the United States. There never were any slaves in Britain itself, but we neatly washed our hands like Pilate and sent them all off to the American South and then blamed the American South for being a slave area. Finally, to show that we do try to improve, even perhaps not on sexual safety, we are currently in my own parliament at the moment, we are passing a bill which is called modern slavery. And that's directed to the level of slavery in the world as a whole, which is thought to be of at least 50 million people. Some of them domestic slaves, some of them agricultural slaves, some of them manufacturing slaves, some of them kept in hostels in North Korea as prisoners year after year after year. So we still have slavery. And the key thing to remember if you're a liberal is that you never stop. There's never a moment when you can say, we have won, we will now move away. There's always another fight to be had. But it's worthwhile because the world gets to be a better place if it has liberal principles, even if it sometimes falls short.
Коллеги, мне кажется, что более...
I think that this is a very worthy completion of the day, and this is the best possible way. That's a fitting end to a wonderful working day. And I would like to thank Mrs. Williams, and she came just for the occasion, and she wanted to participate in one session, and she came long distance, and to express her solidarity with our school. And for us, it's extremely important. I'm not going just to keep silent about the beauty and the final phraseology of her presentation, because you've listened to the presentation of a real politician with a big name, person with clear-cut ideas, with wonderful presentation, spirited, concentrated, vibrant, so for a person for whom the moral criteria in politics are extremely important. And I'm always happy, I'm always very much interested just to listen to Mrs. Williams. And I couldn't fail to pay attention to the fact that as our guest so forbade to call herself Baroness. Because in Russia 2 revolutions took place before we stopped calling them dukes and baronesses and barons. And so we value this, the value of your time and your visit, and so I'd like to recognize your presence. Thank you.
So we are waiting for you next time.
Коллеги, хорошего вечера и избегайте сексуальной деградации, я прошу вас.